We need to talk about how incarcerated people in the US have been seriously injured and even killed while working dangerous jobs with little or no training. Because this new investigation from the Associated Press found that prisoners are doing everything from fighting wildfires to operating heavy machinery to working on industrial farms and meat processing plants. And despite the risks that these jobs entail and these people are taking, they are denied the basic rights and protections guaranteed to other American workers. And so where I'll start here is to note that there are around 800,000 incarcerated people employed in some sort of state or federal work program in the US. And to be clear, that is not always by choice, right? And that's because the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude only when it isn't punishment for a crime. So as a result, prisoners across the country can be sentenced to hard labor, being forced to work and punished if they refuse. And in most of the cases, they're being paid pennies on the hour doing things like laundry and mopping floors inside prisons. But what less people know is that they're also doing some of the country's dirtiest and most dangerous jobs. In many states, for example, laws actually mandate that prisoners be deployed during emergencies and disasters. And in some rural communities in Georgia, incarcerated individuals are actually the sole responders for everything from car wrecks to medical emergencies. And they're paid nothing. Meanwhile, in California, we see the state's more than 1,000 incarcerated firefighters being paid as much as $5 a day, plus a whole extra dollar an hour when they're working during emergencies. With, for example, 22-year-old Shauna Lynn Jones being one of them. Right, and she's a standout because with just 6 weeks left on her sentence for a nonviolent crime, she and her crew got sent to fight a fire in Malibu, but then a boulder fell 100 feet from a hillside onto her head, making her one of the 10 incarcerated firefighters killed in the state since 1989. And that was actually a case where the family received compensation to cover the hospital expenses and funeral, but that's something of an exception. See, workers' compensation, it's only offered to incarcerated individuals in some states. And when it is, the amount is typically determined by the size of their paycheck. So because their wages are so low compared to a civilian worker, incarcerated workers are eligible for far less. I mean, in one case, for example, Nevada's Supreme Court determined that an injured firefighter could receive the equivalent of only about 50 cents a day in workers' comp, ruling that the amount should be based on how much he earned in prison instead of minimum wage. And similarly, the few cases that result in settlements are often far less than what they would be otherwise. And that's in part because those behind bars are seen as having little or no future earning potential, which is why you have Chris Peterson, an ACLU lawyer who filed a lawsuit on behalf of a group of incarcerated firefighters who got second-degree burns while getting paid $1 an hour, telling the AP, at the end of the day, the idea is that if I get my finger lopped off, if I am an incarcerated person working as a firefighter, I am entitled to less relief than if I am a firefighter that's not incarcerated. And actually with that, just getting less is in some ways a best-case scenario, where more often than not, incarcerated workers end up with nothing. And that's because in many states, prisoners are not classified as employees. And what that means is they're just straight up excluded from workers' compensation benefits along with state and federal laws that set minimum standards for health and safety on the job. Plus, in most of the country, public institutions actually can't be held liable at all for incarcerated workers' injuries or deaths. And that's what happened to Candy Fueling, for example, who nearly died while assigned to work at a Colorado sawmill, with her saying she received only a few hours of training and that her injury was in part caused by a manager urging her to hurry up, and saying that despite being dizzy and confused, she was put back to work in the prison's laundry room almost immediately after being patched up. Also saying she received almost no additional treatment for months, even when her wound started oozing green pus. And finally, after all of that, a lawsuit was dismissed after a court ruled she wasn't even allowed to sue state entities. And in fact, what we see with that case in terms of the questionable medical treatment Fueling received, it's another important part of this issue. Right? Incarcerated workers, they can't call an ambulance or demand to be taken to a hospital even if they suffer a life-threatening injury on the job. And the AP documented several cases of prisoners' conditions worsening even after getting care for their injuries. And with that, it's notable that prisons and jails often hire physicians who have been disciplined for misconduct. Right? A Louisiana state prison, for example, they employed a doctor who served 2 years in prison after buying $8,000 worth of methamphetamine in a Home Depot parking lot with intent to distribute. And so yes, of course, second chances are all good, but the problem is that this man was hired even while he was barred from practicing medicine in most other settings, with prisons being one of the only exceptions. Or in other words, it was kind of like, we don't trust you to treat most people, but I guess we'll let you treat inmates because they're not really people. And in fact, there have been reports in several states of prisons hiring doctors without full medical licenses. And on one hand, you have people saying it's really hard to find people who want to do those jobs, and sometimes you have to make compromises. But for others, it's just another example showing how incarcerated lives can be valued less than the lives of others. How these people are not seen as people. And so with all that, you have Michael Duff, a law professor at St. Louis University, telling the AP, we've got this category of human beings that can be wrongfully harmed and yet left with no remedy for their harm. And adding that an entire class of society is being denied civil rights, and saying things could change if there was the political will. And actually, to that point, there is something of a push to deal with forced labor at the federal level by revising the 13th Amendment. But there's actually no signs right now that that could actually happen. But at the state level, we've seen things like Colorado amending its own constitution to ban forced labor in prisons way back in 2018, which actually led to a wave of other states doing the same. But as we've talked about on the show, those reforms often don't lead to meaningful change. And in part, that's because there are a lot of problems with the system, even if you make it voluntary. The Prison Litigation Reform Act was passed in the 1990s, placing several restrictions on prisoners' ability to file civil rights lawsuits. And you have a Supreme Court ruling that's been in place for decades, making it so that incarcerated individuals can't join or form unions. And also more recently, in 2022, in Arizona, for example, a bill was passed limiting the evidence prisoners can present in lawsuits following work-related injuries. And notably, the nonprofit organization that lobbied for that bill, it was headed by one of the men who ran an egg company called Hickman's Family Farms, which, wouldn't you know it, just happened to be the Arizona correctional industry's biggest customer, bringing in nearly $35 million in revenue the past 6 fiscal years. So with that, I should also note that the jobs for incarcerated people at this particular company, they're actually voluntary and even highly desired by some prisoners. In fact, several current and formerly incarcerated workers praised the company. And to that point, all of this is not to say that offering incarcerated people the opportunity to work is inherently a bad idea. But I mean, many prisoners reportedly see work as a welcome break from the boredom and violence inside their facilities. And actually, very few critics believe that all prison jobs should be eliminated. They just say that the work should be voluntary and prisoners should be fairly paid and treated humanely.